Once again, it's time for A Moment with Bob, brought to you by your friends at Offshore Drilling. Tonight's episode, The Shelf Life of Monsters. Hey, Mike. Universal Studios' reign of terror began with the release of Dracula and Frankenstein in 1931. The following year, Boris Karloff lurched from his ancient sarcophagus in The Mummy. Soon, The Invisible Man and The Werewolf of London joined Universal's pantheon of monsters. Monsters were big box office. Horror films enabled the studio to stay afloat during the Depression years, and Universal cranked out sequel after sequel to keep moviegoers coming back for more. After 3 more Frankenstein films, Bride of, Son of, and Ghost of Frankenstein, some bright boy at Universal noticed a drop in ticket sales. If one monster wasn't pulling in the audience, then maybe teaming up 2 monsters might revive the franchise. Hence, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. And if 2 monsters tearing up the screen doesn't do the trick, how about 3? House of Frankenstein added Dracula to the monster mix, and a year later, the terror trio of Dracula, the Wolfman, and Frankenstein's monster were reunited in The House of Dracula. For over 14 years, Universal Studios milked the horror genre for all it was worth. The monsters that terrified filmgoers during the Depression had, by the end of World War II, lost their scary movie mojo. What could the studio do to get the last penny out of their Resident Evils? If they couldn't use the monsters to scare the audience, then they'd play them for laughs. In Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, the horror cycle was officially over, but there was still one more way to cash in on the monsters: television. In the 50s, Universal unloaded their library of horror films to independent television stations eager for cheap programming, and the baby boom generation discovered for themselves the monsters. At 10:30 every Saturday night, I'd be sitting way too close to our Zenith black and white television for KTNT's Nightmare. For the next hour and a half until the station signed off for the night, I learned everything I needed to know about the monsters. To protect yourself, you needed garlic, wolfbane, holy water, crucifixes, wooden stakes, silver bullets, and whatever you do, don't let the Mummy get at the brew made from tanna leaves during the full moon. If you couldn't dispatch the fiends during the dead of night, the next best protection from werewolves and vampires was daylight. Lawrence Talbot would change back into human form with the sunrise, and if touched by the light of dawn, Dracula would turn to dust. You were safe from the worst of the monsters during the day. Regardless of what time of day it was, you could always avoid the staggering Frankenstein monster or the foot-dragging mummy by simply walking faster. At the time, I was told by my parents and the nuns at school that watching that junk would turn my brain to mush, and it wasn't healthy to be fascinated with the macabre. Well, anyone who spent as much time as I did glued to the screen watching that junk knows more about how to deal with Republicans than all the reporters and pundits of mainstream media and the entire leadership of the Democratic Party combined. You don't negotiate with monsters. You don't make deals with vampires. You don't reach across the aisle to create bipartisanship with the undead. All vampires want to do is rip your throat open and drink your blood. Werewolves were driven to tear you to pieces. If you're standing between the mummy and a bubbling cauldron of tanna leaves, he's going to rip you in half like a phone book. The only way to appease these guys is to kill yourself before they get their hands on you. Nope. There's only one way to deal with monsters. They have to be dragged out of their coffins, their grotesque laboratories, and all the dark corners where the ghouls nest, to be brought smoking and howling into broad daylight. That's what the villagers did in the movies. But we don't do that. I don't think enough Americans learned anything from Universal Studios horror films. Too bad for us. If you've never seen the movies, you don't know beans about accountability. We don't know who murdered John Kennedy. It's up for grabs who really pulled off 9/11. All we really know for certain is the official government story doesn't wash. But the criminals have made up the cabal that plotted and succeeded in overthrowing our government are well known to us, and we have done nothing to bring them to justice. 10 years ago, the Supreme Court of the United States broke all the laws they needed in order to steal the election for George W. Bush. As Vincent Bugliosi wrote in None Dare Call It Treason, quote, The stark reality, and I say this with every fiber of my being, is that the institution Americans trust the most to protect its freedoms and principles committed one of the biggest and most serious crimes this nation has ever seen, pure and simple, the theft of the presidency. And by definition, the perpetrators of this crime have to be denominated criminals. End quote. Everyone who understands Bugliosi's words know that the day the Supreme Court handed the presidency to Bush was the last day this country existed as we understood it. For all intents and purposes, the United States of America was over. The mega criminals took over 10 years ago. They haven't gone anywhere, and they're not done stealing every last dime out of us that they can. We did not boil out into the streets and demand justice, so we didn't get any. Bush's successor, the current corporate stooge running the country, made it clear that he was not going to demand accountability and drag those swine into a courtroom ever. Since we have not held the Republican criminals accountable, they're coming back. Fueled by corporate money is speech financing courtesy of the Supreme Court, rigged voting machines, and the 24/7 Fox News fertilizer spreader, we're likely to see in a few days the Republican monster machine come roaring back into town. Sarah Palin and Rudy Giuliani have endorsed an honest-to-God war criminal for North Carolina's 7th Congressional District. Ilario Pantano killed 2 unarmed Iraqis while serving in Iraq. Pantano shot the men repeatedly after stopping their vehicle at a checkpoint. He admitted to emptying 1 magazine of bullets into the Iraqis and reloaded and fired 30 more rounds into the dead men. He then hung a sign over their corpses that read, "No better friend, no worse enemy." Despite his admission, the military cleared Pantano of wrongdoing in 2005. This guy's scarier than the entire cast of House of Frankenstein. He's real. Tomorrow, get ready for Monster Mash 2010. With the moon riding high and the wind in the trees, see the newly elected creatures lurching out of their graves and shamble toward our nation's capital. They're back. Regards, Bob. Another moment with Bob, brought to you by your friends at Offshore Drilling.